Welcome everybody to this Pharos Lecture. My name is Nigel Biggar. I am the Regius Professor Emeritus of Moral Theology in this university, and I'm the Chairman of the Board of the Pharos Foundation, which is why I get the privilege of introducing this evening's eminent speaker. John Gray retired as Professor of European Thought at the London School of Economics in 2007. But before that, he was a fellow and tutor in politics at Jesus College here in Oxford for over 20 years. In his career, by my reckoning, he's published 26 books, the latest one being this year's The New Leviathans, Thoughts After Liberalism. And I noticed that 7 of those books have been published since 2007, which suggests that he's having an unusually active retirement. In the mid-1990s, I think, John Gray blossomed from being a dusty don into a prominent public intellectual who has since elicited praise from the likes of George Soros and whom Nassim Nicholas Taleb has described as prophetic. The title of his Pharos lecture this evening is What is Living and What is Dead in Liberalism. So please welcome to the podium Professor John Gray.
Thank you very much, Nigel, for that generous introduction, and thank you all for turning up to hear my thoughts tonight. My subject is what is living and what is dead in liberalism. And I'll begin with Margaret Thatcher's handbag. A story has it that while chairing a Conservative policy meeting, Mrs. Thatcher opened her bag and produced a copy of the Austrian economist and philosopher F.A. Hayek's book, or perhaps I should say treatise, The Constitution of Liberty. Slamming it down on the table, she told the assembled Tories, "This is what we believe." I've always doubted the truth of this story. Hayek's book is a bulky volume, over 500 pages long. It's hard to imagine Thatcher carrying it around with her, even if she did sport rather large handbags. Then there was Thatcher's turn of mind. Educated as a scientist at Somerville and working for a time as a research chemist, she had a keen eye for facts. If she did lug Hayek's tome around with her, she could not have failed to notice that the book's postscript is entitled, Why I Am Not a Conservative. In his treatise, and in the conversations I had with him in the 80s, Hayek insisted he was a liberal. If Thatcher imbibed a philosophy of politics from him, if she did, it was a particular kind of liberalism, one in which the anarchic energy of the free market was hailed as a means of accelerating human progress. In contrast, the conservative tradition, as it was embodied in Britain in Benjamin Disraeli, Stanley Baldwin, Harold Macmillan, and other leading thinkers and politicians, aimed to moderate change. Preserving common forms of life was as important as increasing economic growth or consumer choice. In conversations I had with Thatcher around that time, she insisted she was continuing this tradition. She never acknowledged, or perhaps understood, that reconstructing British institutions on a market model brought it to an end. The tale of Hayek and the handbag may be apocryphal, but it illuminates 3 aspects of liberalism at this time. The first is the self-destruction, now almost complete, of the libertarian creed Thatcher absorbed, at least in part, from Hayek. The second is the rise of a species of hyperliberalism, sometimes called woke, which aims to limit freedom of thought and expression in order to secure human progress. The third is the simultaneous rise of a project of technocratic government in which moral and political judgment are displaced by scientific expertise. Now, what I want to argue tonight, my primary argument tonight, is that all these challenges come from within liberalism. The true threat to liberal values does not come from Marxism or from postmodern French philosophy, or even from the autocratic regimes that are the avowed enemies of liberal values. It comes from a liberal ideology that equated human freedom with unfettered choice, which is the fatal conceit, I think, of Hayek's philosophy and the undoing of the market state he promoted. It comes from the inflation of rights by using them to impose values many people do not share, which erodes the practice of tolerance. It comes from a cult of technocracy, which began when liberalism denied its roots in Western religion and became itself a religion. Liberalism, I suggest, has not been displaced by illiberal philosophies and values. Liberalism has become itself illiberal. Of course, liberal is a highly elastic term. Used in reference to a political movement, it's an early 19th century coinage originating in Spain in campaigns for constitutional government. But in the late 17th century, John Locke defined classical liberal thinking in terms of rights supposed to be held equally by all human beings and conferred on them by God. In the late 18th century, Immanuel Kant placed an idea of human autonomy, also based on religion, at the heart of liberalism. Later, the eminent Victorian John Stuart Mill grounded liberalism in what he called, taking the term from the French thinker Auguste Comte, a religion of humanity. By no means all liberals have shared Hayek's enthusiasm for the free market. The founders of classical economics are often regarded as canonical liberals, yet they urged that free markets had to be restrained by other institutions if they were not to have injurious effects on society. Adam Smith argued that the commercial spirit, working without restraint, weakened the martial virtues that were needed if liberal societies were to survive. No one believed that the market could survive without an ethical basis. Yet for a generation, libertarian ideology conquered, in various degrees, all the mainstream parties in this country. Liberals of the centre-right and left tweaked the free market programme to make it more electorally palatable, but agreed that it represented the future, not only for the West, but for all of humankind. What all these liberals had in common was a claim to universal authority for their values, which were confidently asserted to be universally human. Over the past 30 years, this liberal faith has been sorely challenged. Many of the societies that threw off communism at the end of the Cold War have not been converted to liberal values. Russia and China are ruled by overtly anti-liberal regimes. Attempts to export liberal democracy beyond the West in Afghanistan and Iraq, Syria and Libya have come to nothing. The outcome of the war in Ukraine after Putin's barbarous invasion is now in doubt as Hamas's pogroms shift American attention from Europe to the Middle East. In geopolitical terms, the West is in steep decline. Within the West, freedoms that were taken for granted in the past, even the recent past, are compromised and endangered. The threat comes not from an authoritarian state, but from within society itself. Universities, charities, professional associations, cultural institutions, and communications media have taken upon themselves the power to police the beliefs and values of their members. Enclaves of freedom remain, like that in which I'm speaking tonight, and some of them may be extending their reach. A liberal civilization, however, is history. It began to consume itself when its intellectual leaders came to believe their values could be freestanding. Against this, I want to argue that tolerance, in some respects the core of liberalism, is inherently judgmental. We tolerate beliefs and practices we judge to be wrong or bad. Presupposing better and worse ways of living, tolerance depended on pre-liberal norms and values. As these norms and values are weakened, liberalism began to eat its own tail. The result is the strange mix of moral indifference and intolerant bigotry that prevails in formerly liberal societies today. I do not want to pass over the anti-liberal movements of the last century or their casualties. Nazism and communism killed tens of millions of people. There are currently demonstrations in European cities. There are currently demonstrators in European cities who, if we go by the slogans they chant, wish to celebrate the Holocaust, the supreme crime against humanity. In September of this year, a bronze statue of Felix Dzerzhinsky, chief of Lenin's secret police, the Cheka, who engineered the first wave of Soviet terror in 1918 to 1922, was unveiled in front of the Lubyanka headquarters of the former KGB, from which an earlier statue had been removed in 1991. If there are such things as memes, ideas competing with one another in Darwinian fashion, the fittest appear to be the most toxic. What I'm concerned with here, however, are not these enemies of liberal values. My subject is instead the metamorphosis of liberalism into a liberal ideology. This is most easily understood in economic policies bewitched by the idea of an all-encompassing free market. Thatcher was a woman of many contradictions. A close advisor to her described her to me as the reality principle in skirts. She refused to privatize the NHS because she believed it was an integral part of British life. She rejected out of hand any idea of selling off the Royal Mail, saying she was not prepared to privatize the Queen's head, the image that appears on postage stamps. In 1989, though, she sold off water utilities, a disastrous move, and imposed the madcap poll tax. Her sense of reality had been deadened by ideology, and her downfall soon followed. While they became more palpable as time passed, Thatcher's contradictions were with her from her early years in power. In 1981, she told the Sunday Times, "Economics are the method, the object is to change the heart and soul of the nation." Her economic policies did change the heart and soul of the nation, but not in the manner she imagined. She aimed to free up markets from regulation while reviving the cohesive and dutiful Britain she remembered from the 1950s. In the event, she demolished the society she recalled with such nostalgic fondness. Ironically, the Britain Thatcher wished to revive was a creation of Labour's post-war settlement. What was later called Old Labour, built a national settlement on state intervention to realise a conception of the common good. This Britain was also, in many respects, a freer country than that which emerged from Hayekian libertarianism. Universities were institutions in which freedom to speak one's mind was unquestioned. No one was silenced because their political outlook was deemed unacceptable by the prevailing consensus. A settlement in which individual freedom and collective well-being were complementary goods remained in place in Britain for a generation. By the mid-70s, the economic foundations of the post-war settlement were crumbling. In 1976, Britain was rescued from financial crisis by a loan from the IMF. Under the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Denis Healey, a programme of public spending cuts was imposed. Keynesian policies of financing economic expansion through borrowing were reined back, and unemployment left to find its level in the market. Labour began dismantling the post-war labour settlement 3 years before Thatcher came to power. Much of what was called Thatcherism was not central in Thatcher's 1979 manifesto. Privatisation was only briefly mentioned. The objectives were lowering inflation, reforming trade union law, and reducing public debt. Thatcher remained, almost to the end, a pragmatic politician as well as a dogmatic thinker. Even so, a Hayekian ideology in which the role of the state was primarily as an enabler of free markets supplanted traditional conservatism. Market liberalism went on to become the ruling philosophy in all the main parties, not only in Britain, but throughout much of the West. Individual choice came to be regarded as a value that trumped all others, first in the economy and then throughout society. But markets in which choice is the only or primary operative value are effectively amoral, and eventually they are rejected as illegitimate. At this point, a fundamental flaw in Hayek's liberalism becomes apparent. The strength of his philosophy was his critique of socialist central planning. Except in wartime, when the resources of society are mobilized for a limited range of common purposes, no government can possess the knowledge or the authority required to govern the economy as a whole. Invariably, the unintended consequences of socialist central planning are waste, poverty, and corruption. This diagnosis has been confirmed by events, notably in China, where dismantling Maoist planning enabled the largest economic expansion in history. Rather than attempting to abolish the market, as Lenin and Stalin aimed to do in Russia, China's leaders after Mao harnessed market forces to the political objectives of the Communist Party. Under Xi Jinping, this has gone with increased repression and economic slowdown, but China is still outpacing the West in many areas of technology. So Hayek's analysis of the unintended consequences of socialist planning was vindicated, but he failed to understand the unintended consequences of unrestrained market capitalism. When unchecked, market forces pervade society, and they deplete the sense of a common good. The liberalism that triumphed in the 90s and noughties welcomed this result. Individual choice was trumpeted as the basis of both markets and personal life. The trouble with prioritizing choice is that choice is ethically empty. Some options are more valuable than others. Having access to decent medical care is a more important component of human well-being than opportunities for gambling, for example. Other options are inherently damaging to those who engage in them and to society at large. Activities that normalize cruelty belong in this category. Videos showing animals being tormented to death for entertainment, a practice exposed by a BBC report earlier this year on the methodical torture and killing of monkeys, are intrinsically vicious. Societies that do not block such options have no future as places in which the good life can be pursued or lived. A consequence of elevating choice over all other values is that it drains the idea of progress of substance. Like Hayek, Thatcher was a firm believer that humankind has advanced throughout history. Unlike Thatcher, Hayek understood that ceaseless progress has no purpose. In the Constitution of Liberty, his great treatise, he declared, this is a direct quote, "Progress is movement for movement's sake." For it is in the process of learning and not the effect, and in the effects of having learned something new, that man enjoys the gift of his intelligence. Progress is movement for movement's sake. But what was learned from the Hayekian experiment? Could it be that turning society into the servant of the market erodes not only society, but eventually the market itself? Politics is not the permanent establishment of any regime, but a succession of partial and temporary remedies for recurring evils. I supported Thatcher from the time she became leader of the Conservative Party in 1975 until the late 80s. I did so because she resisted the chief evils of that time, the declining type of capitalism that prevailed in Britain and communism throughout the world. I do not regret my support for her at that time, but I try to be empirical in my thinking, and today some of the principal evils in the West come from the cult of choice that she unwittingly brought into being. When choice is enthroned as the supreme value, human relationships tend to become transactional and provisional. Families are dissolved when they no longer serve the needs of their adult members. Cities become profit-driven makeshifts rather than enduring human settlements. Ways of life that endured for generations vanish in years or months. As a 19th century critic of capitalism foresaw, all that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned. But the revolt against global capitalism has not come from the left, as Marx expected. Treating human labor as a disposable commodity left many people abandoned and many more insecure. The result was a demand for shelter from global markets that surprised the left. Swathes of voters rejected the society generated by market liberalism. They defied established political elites, not for the sake of any dream of a utopian future, but simply in order to preserve or recover a measure of stability in their lives. Brexit and the election of Donald Trump came as a shock to liberals of all stripes. For them, these political eruptions were expressions of populism, a conglomeration of irrational forces whipped up by wicked demagogues exploiting the basest instincts of the untutored masses. In fact, what the liberals dismissed as populism was political blowback from the social disruption produced by their own policies, which they failed to comprehend or to understand. 30 years of unchecked markets left millions of workers stranded in post-industrial wastelands, while the living standards of much of the middle classes stagnated or even fell. For these liberals, market forces were engines of progress, and they had no pity for the casualties of progress. Believers in the indefinite improvability of human beings, they invoked an idea of evil, these evil demagogues, or the evil instincts of the untutored masses, that had no basis in reality. They invoked an idea of evil because they had no credible conception of the good, which they equated with the exercise of choice. Running in tandem with the cult of choice is a parallel cult of rights. Rights are useful, sometimes indispensable, in protecting widely shared values. When they aim to enshrine values that are widely disputed, they become sources of division in society. Human rights are not self-validating moral facts. They protect weighty human interests, which can be identified only by invoking an understanding of the human good. Tolerance is needed because no one conception of the good will ever be adopted by everyone. When there's general agreement on the most basic human interests, the scope and content of rights can be legally arbitrated. When rights express radically different conceptions of the good, clashes between them become irresolvable. Conflicts around the value of human life fall under this heading. Disputes over abortion are intractable in America, not just because they express strongly held views. Irreconcilable rights prevent the compromises, rights to choice and rights to life and so on, Such irreconcilable rights prevent the compromises that can be negotiated in democratic assemblies. The result is not to insulate abortion from political challenge, as liberals hoped. The result is instead to politicize judicial institutions. The capture of the American Supreme Court by conservative judges was the predictable outcome of the inflation of rights. The overreach of law eventually politicizes every institution, and a sphere of life that is outside of politics, one of the most basic features of a liberal society, disappears. It's then not long before the law breaks down, and a condition not unlike the state of nature pictured by Thomas Hobbes becomes endemic. In this case, the case of America at the moment, the war of all against all is between groups asserting rival rights. My own views on issues such as abortion and assisted suicide are those of an old-fashioned liberal who gives priority to the considered judgments of individuals. But I accept that these are not issues that can be resolved by invoking simple ideas of choice and rights. There needs to be a reasoned debate about the core values of our society, and here, our historical inheritance of religion cannot be put on one side. I think of myself as an atheist, and yet it is clear to me that it was monotheism that gave us liberal tolerance. In a familiar narrative, tolerance originated with Socrates and was renewed in the European Enlightenment. In a contrary view I find more compelling, tolerance as we have practiced it in the West started with the questioning recorded in the book of Job. Socrates, it seems to me, was not the godfather of free inquiry portrayed in standard histories of philosophy. He may have claimed that he knew only that he knew nothing, but as he is represented by Plato, he never doubted that truth and goodness were one and the same. Socratic dialogue, Socratic doubt, was a method of argument aimed at uncovering indubitable truth. Job's doubts were more radical. He questioned any moral order in the world, including that secured by God. When he returned to his God, it was by an act of faith in a deity he could not fully know or understand. In this biblical tradition, doubt and faith were not opposites, but mutually enriching exercises of the soul. Both were needed if human beings were to live as free agents. The coexistence of faith and doubt within the individual was, I suggest, the original template for the coexistence of different faiths in society. There have, of course, been regimes of toleration that are not liberal. Ancient Persia, Buddhist India, and the Ottoman Empire, at certain points in their histories, secured a modus vivendi between different religions, but it was freedom accorded to groups or communities, not to individuals. I'm far from dismissing the achievements of these regimes. Indeed, if liberalism fails, they may well provide models from which we can learn a great deal. Liberal tolerance emerged from the early modern European wars of religion. It came to be accepted that because God's nature cannot be fully discovered, there needs to be mutual forbearance among believers. Tolerance was a condition of peace. But it was also a response to the limitations of human knowledge. In the Enlightenment, reason was exalted as the means whereby human knowledge can be expanded across all areas of life. In Jewish and Christian religion, there are truths beyond rational demonstration. I believe it is this idea of truth, independent of human beings and only partly knowable by them, that is the ultimate source of tolerance as it has been practiced in the West. If you have no idea of truth, you can have no use for doubt. If you do not allow that some truths are beyond human understanding, truth becomes whatever human beings, the most powerful among them, or those who claim to have the most knowledge at any rate, decided to be. Truth becomes a human construction. We can see these tensions in John Stuart Mill's defense of liberty. He argued for freedom of speech and inquiry on several grounds, but the chief among them was the belief that it allows human knowledge to grow, But a paradox haunts this familiar argument. As human knowledge expands, the sphere of free inquiry shrinks. Mill believed the growth of knowledge extended to ethics. Some ethical outlooks, all of them in fact, apart from his own, were irrational and erroneous. But if differences in values result from demonstrable errors in fact or logic, what reason can there be for tolerance? It may be that this question that prompted Mill in On Liberty to propose the establishment of a publicly funded devil's advocate, charged with producing objections to the most well-founded beliefs. I think we could do with one today, actually, by the way. Wouldn't cost much. The saint of rationalism, as Gladstone called Mill, looked to the devil for salvation from rationalist orthodoxy. Mill's conflicts came partly from his admiration for Auguste Comte, who I mentioned earlier, the French founder of positivism and the original source of the project of technocratic government. For Comte, liberal civilization was a phase in human development rather than the end point of history. There were three phases of development: the theological, in which the world is understood by reference to gods, spirits, or magic; the metaphysical, in which it is explained in terms of the essences and purposes of things; and finally, what he called a positive stage, in which it's investigated by the use of scientific method. Crucially, Comte believed that the advance of knowledge rendered the moralities of the past redundant or harmful, including the morality of liberalism. As knowledge advanced, conflicts of values would be settled increasingly by scientific expertise. A new science of sociology, a term Comte himself invented, would reveal not only how society functioned, but the ends it should pursue. More intelligent and more realistic than many other Enlightenment thinkers, Comte believed that religion is necessary for social order. That's why he established what he called the religion of humanity, with its own chapels, priests, and daily rituals, in which humankind superseded God as the object of worship. By the way, it might be worth mentioning in passing that the daily rituals he devised included some based on what he believed to be the science of phrenology, and involved touching points on one's own cranium and forehead, which were identified with benevolence and progress. So if you did this every day, you would gradually become more benevolent and more progressive. Phrenology, now called sociology. A new organic society, Comte believed, would be established, like that of medieval Christendom, which he greatly admired, but based on science, not on faith, as medieval Christendom was. Once it was set once it came into existence, there would be no more need for tolerance in ethics and politics than there is in physics or chemistry. So tolerance was a fungible virtue. You only needed it when, in the pre-organic phase, when organic societies were rebuilt on the basis of science, it was no longer needed. So Comte was an explicit enemy of liberalism. In fact, he had a significant influence on the European far right, including some of the leaders of the interwar fascist movements in France and other countries. And also paradoxically, as I've mentioned on Mill. But Comte's secular religion formed the template for liberal humanism. In other words, the liberalism that emerged, the religion that emerged from his work was primarily a liberal humanist religion. The central categories of monotheism were reproduced with some crucial differences. The unfolding pattern of history, which for believers in traditional religions was known only by God, could be grasped and accelerated, Comte thought, and his followers thought, by human action. The key attraction of the religion of humanity is that it is a theodicy, an explanation of the existence of evil in the world. Wickedness is a kind of error which declines along with the increase of knowledge. I think one can say fairly confidently that this is a view that history has conclusively falsified. The Holocaust was conceived and implemented in the most highly educated nation of what was then the most intellectually advanced region of the world. Mass murder in the former Soviet Union was not the work of ignorant peasants, but of thinkers steeped in philosophy, politics, economics, and literature. Yet this humanist theodicy retains an unshakable grasp on the liberal mind. For anyone who rejects theism, human history can only be, I suggest, what it was for the ancient Greek tragedians, a tale of folly and madness with occasional interludes of peace and civilization. If you believe evil comes from ignorance, you will think rule by the most knowledgeable, the best form of government. In Comte's philosophy, a body of experts could decide what best served the well-being of the individual and the overall welfare of society. For Mill, this was a horrifying prospect. Comte Mill wrote, aimed at establishing a despotism of society over the individual, surpassing anything contemplated in the political ideas of the most rigid disciplinarians among the ancient philosophers. Yet, at the same time, Comte was irresistibly attracted. Mill was irresistibly attracted to Comte's philosophy and to his religion. As he put it in On Liberty, man was a progressive being, and it was this imaginary species that would replace God as the object of piety. In Mill, the conversion of liberalism into a religion of progress and humanity is undeniable. If you believe that ethics and politics can be sciences like physics or chemistry, ethical dilemmas are rationally soluble problems. Anyone who thinks otherwise is beyond the pale of reason and humanity. And this is a view, if you think this is a caricature, that's been revived more recently in Oxford by proponents of effective altruism, who think that if you don't accept that it's better to preserve the hypothetical human beings who may exist a million years from now, than help some rather perhaps imperfect and not very intelligent human beings now, then you're irrational, because reason is about maximizing value. What is now called the woke movement, which I prefer to call hyperliberalism, adopts this position. There can be no tolerance for enemies of progress. Resistance to progressive values can only be a sign of ignorance or malevolence. Equally, equality, diversity, and inclusion are not only self-evidently more important than other values, such as individual freedom and social cohesion, they are also harmonious. They dovetail with one another. If including one group seems to the untutored mind to involve excluding another, it can only be because the other is a beneficiary of privilege. In some respects, hyperliberalism is a mutant version of Christianity. Contrary to some of its conservative critics, hyperliberalism is far from being a reversion to pagan values. The ancient pagan world worshipped vitality and power. The gods were capricious and cruel. Christianity was a revaluation of these pagan values, in which a broken and powerless human being could be divine. In identifying with victims, a selection of them at any rate, woke movements are vehicles, I think, for a secular hyper-Christianity emptied of any sense of mystery and any commitment to forgiveness. In the struggle for progress, there are no genuine casualties. The Jewish and Christian religions take a different view. Our world is shaped by tragic conflicts. Tragedy is not imperfectibility, for in truth we have no clear idea of perfection. Nor is it the fact that moral progress is intermittent and reversible. Human beings encounter tragedy when whatever they do incurs irreparable loss and even wrong. A feature of tragic conflicts is that they have no single rational solution. This last point is illustrated in a story the late Isaiah Berlin told me from the Second World War. A government official during the war summoned the secretaries in his office and announced that they were all going to be sacked. One of them was known to be leaking information to the enemy, but the person could not be identified, or at least not quickly enough. The official admitted that sacking them all would be a great injustice. Not only would they lose their jobs and their incomes, but they would be unable to acquire any similar position in future. Even so, he concluded, it was an injustice he was prepared to commit. The alternative of doing nothing, of keeping his hands clean, would mean sending brave men and women to avoidable and often terrible deaths and an increased risk of losing the war. Now, a utilitarian would say that in regretting the injustice he was committing, the official was being irrational. Surely reason dictates we aim for the greatest good. But this assumes rational action means maximizing some measurable end, so that when that end is achieved, nothing is lost. Recognizing that loss is inescapable, I suggest, is a truer reflection of human experience. There is truth in ethics, but not of the kind that can be accumulated in science. The methods of scientific inquiry are our best guide to understanding the world of facts, but they cannot prescribe the goals of human action or supply meaning in human life. Neither can they tell us what to do when our values conflict with one another, as they did in Berlin's story. The official was applying what I would describe as an ethical version of Occam's razor. The medieval logician enjoined that we do not multiply entities beyond necessity. Berlin's official tried to do the same with tragedies. Mill was appalled by Comte's authoritarian philosophy, yet the seeds of a technocratic illiberalism were present in the ethics Mill inherited from Bentham. The founder of utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham, proposed a reevaluation of values in terms of satisfying wants, with the best action being the one that produced the most pleasure. This implied that pleasures were all of equal worth, provided they yielded the same satisfaction. However, Mill believed some pleasures, the higher pleasures of the mind, were more valuable than others. But in fact, qualitative distinctions between pleasures run counter to the quantifying ambitions of utilitarianism. Mill's attempt to modify Benthamism in accordance with his intuitions of value left his liberal disciples with an incoherent ethical outlook. A variant of Mill's utilitarianism persists in programs aiming to minimize harm at the present time. Harm prevention can be a useful strategy in contexts where the harms concerned can be defined and measured in uncontroversial terms. Minimizing deaths in some medical contexts may be an example. But harm is not a value-neutral idea, and when we move to issues that affect the quality of life, Bentham's moral arithmetic can be misleading. Drug legalization has been proposed as a way of reducing harm to users of drugs and to others they may rob to feed their habit. Existing evidence does not clearly support legalization for these reasons, but even if it did, the issue would not be settled. Would a society in which a majority spent much of their lives in a drug-induced stupor or high truly be better than one in which most enjoy and suffer life as it comes to them? That's the question posed 100 years ago in Huxley's Brave New World, and it has yet to be answered. It doesn't seem to be one that interests many liberals. Unknowing disciples of Comte, for most of them have never heard of the founder of positivism, they embrace his project of a scientific ethics without any of Mill's doubts. In this now almost dominant philosophy, truth in both ethics and politics is whatever the most rational section of humankind determines it to be. If they use their power to silence dissent, it is for the sake of progress, an end no right-thinking person could question. Freedom of thought has no intrinsic value. The implicit ideal is freedom from thought. History runs in cycles, and it may be that the self-destruction of Western liberalism will be followed by a re-emergence of freedom and tolerance in some other time and place. The myth of Ouroboros suggests an eternal return, or liberal civilization may have been an unrepeatable coincidence of historical accidents. In any case, history cannot be rewound, and some allegedly more authentic type of classical liberalism reinstalled. there can be no going back to the liberalism that's been lost. So what then is living in liberalism? A comprehensive program for saving what is valuable in our liberal inheritance, if that's still possible, is far beyond my powers. I can only sketch the barest outlines of a way ahead. Three things I think need to be salvaged: tolerance, judgment, and the idea of truth. First, tolerance must be renewed. Divergence in values and views of the world is not a mark of intellectual backwardness. That will be someday erased by the increase in knowledge. Diversity of these kinds go with being human. A world united by a consensus on progress is a dream of reason, which in practice becomes a nightmare. Since our experiences as humans will forever be in some ways dissonant, we'd better learn again how to live together. But tolerance can't be detached from any conception of the good or be unlimited or neutral. It can only survive when it's embedded in strong forms of ethical life. Secondly, and relatedly, the importance of moral judgment must be reasserted. The project of reducing ethics to a type of technical expertise must be firmly rejected. An integral part of liberalism is the conviction that reasonable people can make judgments of value that are divergent and incompatible. If we give this up, we give up liberalism. Thirdly, and most importantly, nothing like liberalism can be renewed without the idea that truth is independent of human will and only partly knowable by the human mind. If you are a religious believer, truth is embodied in God. If you are not, it lies in dilemmas reason can identify but not resolve. Either way, we live in search of a reality we have not made. Skepticism is not the denial of truth, but the acceptance that truth may be surprising. I began with a possibly apocryphal story and will end with one. Stanley Baldwin is not someone we associate with grand theories. The pipe-smoking pig farmer who was Prime Minister 3 times between 1923 and 1937 cultivated a public image of bluff common sense. One can't help suspecting he was concealing an acutely skeptical intelligence. Towards the end of his life, it's said, Baldwin was asked if he'd been guided in politics by any great idea. To everyone's surprise, he said he had been. As a young man, he was much impressed by the legal historian Sir Henry Maine's book, Ancient Law, first published in 1861. In the book, Maine presented what came to be called the Whig interpretation of history. Society advanced from an order based on hierarchy and obedience to one grounded in freedom and consent. It was this majestic idea of progress, Baldwin declared, that had guided him all his life. The movement from status to contract. Then he paused. Or was it, he asked, the other way around?
So, first of all, John, thank you very much indeed for a very thought-provoking lecture. I hesitated before using the word thought-provoking because that's what everyone says about every lecture, but in this case, I was very provoked. In a good way. So, I checked and you checked, and the last time I interviewed you was about 20 years ago. So
2004, yes.
So it's time for a refresh. Let's start with Thatcher.
Yes.
So I'm 7 years younger than you are, and I came up to Oxford in October '73 to study history at Worcester College. And there I was in my garret in Beaumont Street, preparing for history prelims, which then happened at the end of the very first term, by candlelight, because there was no power, because the electricity stations were shut down, because there was no coal, because the miners were on strike. And I also learnt to drink my tea with no sugar because the docks were closed by strikers. And the London Times ran a series of leading articles under the title of "Is Britain Governable?" My own view is, however bad things are right now, they were a lot worse than the 1970s. And something had to happen, and it was going to involve conflict. So I supported Thatcher, and you said you did too. So my first question to you is, as a Thatcherite in Jesus College Senior Common Room, how did that go down?
Well, I'll begin by saying that in 1974, I had a similar experience to yours, which at that time I was teaching at the University of Essex, and the students at the University of Essex rose and prevented all heating oil coming into the university for a couple of months. They removed the wheels from lorries, turned them upside down, and so we were cut off from the world. And so I learned something which I suspect not many people here, except possibly migrants and people who have experienced war, would have discovered, which is how many kettles it takes to fill a bath even by an inch or two. It's far more than you think. So I too had experienced some of those losses of everyday facilities and amenities that you experienced when you were writing in candlelight. And that radicalized me, but not in the direction of socialism or progressive liberalism, but into supporting Thatcher for partly those reasons. Britain was becoming semi-ungovernable and something had to be done. And she had a set of clear ideas, fairly simple ideas, I think, whose long-term consequences she didn't know or even think about very much. And I believed, unlike most conservatives at the time, and certainly unlike the leading conservatives in the cabinet and in the party, I believed that she had a decent chance of implementing them. And so I did publicly support her from then onwards. What was the attitude in Jesus College Common Room? Sublime indifference. The most pure form of tolerance there is. They either didn't know. Let's not forget Oxford was and still is a decentralized institution where colleges are separate in governance and other respects, but they're also, each college is multidisciplinary, so you don't go around bumping into other political philosophers who have different interpretations of political theorists. The people you talk to at dinner or lunch are very often people from completely different disciplines. I would talk to physicists or chemists or archaeologists or whatever. So a cohesive and repressive ideology like woke or anything, it just couldn't easily form at that time. And so I benefited from that. So I never had, I might have been taken aside once or twice and hints may have been dropped that my career might not flourish to the enormous strengths it would otherwise achieve if I persisted in my Thatcherite inclinations. I thanked those who gave me this invaluable advice and ignored it. And nothing happened, absolutely nothing. But there is perhaps an anecdote which might illustrate some of the paradoxes of academic life and Thatcherism. Later on, I think in 1986 or 1987, Thatcher decided to abolish academic tenure in this country and did do so. And when I heard that she decided this, I knew that her mind was made up. I knew that nothing anyone could say would change it. She often did that before she made her mind up, but when she'd made it up, she very rarely backed down. And by chance, I found myself alone with her after a meeting in London, and I thought I would take up this issue with her. So I asked her, I said, Prime Minister, you're proposing, she hadn't done it yet, to abolish academic tenure in this country. She said, yes. And I said, well, the other academic supporters, if you, Thatcher and you, Prime Minister, and your policies, all 11 of them, there were more than that, but not very many more, maybe 20 or 30, and I knew most of them. They're almost all, to a single man and woman, opposed to this policy of abolishing tenure. And the reason they're opposed to it is that they believe that unpopular minorities, even in academic life can be discriminated against, can be denied career advancement, or even prevented from getting jobs, or even removed from jobs in a situation where there is no academic tenure. And since I knew that, I knew I wouldn't change her mind, but I tried to find the strongest arguments I could. I knew she admired everything American. So I said, and that's why in America there is academic tenure. It's to protect unpopular minorities, intellectual minorities within academic life. And indeed, I think you might even, Prime Minister, lose some support. This is where I made my mistake in my attempt to persuade her. Among your academic supporters, if you go ahead and abolish academic tenure. And she looked at me with what I later came to recognize, and even by then had come to recognize, as stony, icy a glare of cold disdain and contempt. And so I said, I repeated my view, you may lose their support. And having looked at me in this ice-cold fashion, she said, then we'll win without you. Which I thought was wonderful, actually. I thought it was absolutely wonderful. And that was the end of the exchange. Now, she was right and wrong. She was right because she went on to win further elections with or without whatever her academic supporters thought about her. Made no difference to those elections. They were completely irrelevant. They were only, I think, in her view, a few dozen votes, actually. That's all, the only significance they had. But in the long run, I think she was wrong. She was mistaken, because we now, 30 years later, find ourselves in a position where, not primarily perhaps because tenure has been abolished, but we do find ourselves in a situation in which, within academic life, people who hold minority views, which now means deviating in some crucial respect, or worse still, several crucial respects, from the prevailing progressive consensus, find it difficult to get a job. It's not easy to choose and pursue doctoral theses on unpopular subjects or thinkers. Supposing I thought one of these, I'm just thinking of doing something on the arguments of Joseph de Maistre in favor of the Inquisition. He did have an extensive large set of arguments. I don't think that would go down tremendously well unless I intended to deconstruct them and show the intersectionality of the arguments that were then used and represent them as examples of the gender and heteronormativity of the discourse of the time. Maybe I could get away with that. But otherwise, I couldn't do it. And if you are in place, you may find yourself at least lonely. You may find your career slowed if you're still pursuing a career. And you may even be removed by various mixes of bureaucratic obstruction, mob disdain, and others. And so her indifference to the fate, if you like, of tolerance in universities was a mistake in the long run. And something's got to be done about it. And whether it's enough to do what the present government has done, which is to bring in legislation which would enable people who'd been in some way have been silenced or deplatformed or cancelled in somewhere in universities to petition against that and get legal redress. I think that would be useful for those who've put their heads over the parapet. But for the great majority who don't put their heads over the parapet, it'll make no difference at all, because the incentives for conformity and orthodoxy, the career incentives for advancing when your position in your future career is determined by people who uphold this progressive orthodoxy, none of those incentives will be changed by that legislation. It'll help those who've already crossed the barrier, put their heads over the parapet, declared themselves to be heretics. It won't help the conformist majority in academic life, which is there as it is in every other way of life. And it's quite difficult to see how this could change quickly because contrary to what many people outside of academia say, academic life is not ruled only by fashions for a very simple institutional reason. It was that academics appoint their successors. So they're not normally going to appoint. In my day, they sometimes did appoint people who thought completely different from themselves. But nowadays that doesn't happen. So my answer is that it was no doubt imperfect in many ways. There might be nepotism, there might be various flaws in the university culture in Oxford and elsewhere in the 1970s, but it was incomparably more pluralistic and incomparably more tolerant, even if, or not even if, that tolerance was often expressed in indifference. If only we could have a national campaign for indifference in academic life. If only there was some chance of people being indifferent to the views of others, then there'd be more freedom and more tolerance.
But John, I mean, you left formal academic life
Yes.
in 2007. Was there any hint of what was to come in terms of a climate of illiberality?
That wasn't the reason I left. I mean, and there wasn't much. In 2007, the woke or hyper-liberal ideology hadn't penetrated to anything like what it has done now in academic life, and there weren't the reason I left was that I wanted to write for, my position didn't involve any teaching or any administration, so I could, in that sense, do what I wanted. But I felt the obligation to write in an academic mode, in an academic genre, on academic subjects that I no longer thought were really of fundamental interest, and I also felt the need to write for a wider audience, so I quit. But there was one sign which I noticed at that time, one very faint sign, although that wasn't, as I say, the reason I left. A chill descended on any seminar if you made a joke. Because jokes belong to that category of human discourse, which can easily be misinterpreted or seen as triggering. Of course, the reason for that is they're meant to trigger. That's why they can be perceived as triggering. They're meant to shake us out of our ordinary habits and enable us to see the absurdities of ourselves and others. That's what they're for, jokes. But I did notice, I did make jokes. I went on recklessly to the end and nothing happened. So I got away with humor. But I felt, is that the kind of environment in which I want to be forever? Is that a kind of environment in which a joke-free environment, an environment in which people would have a kind of wooden, po-faced gravity about everything they said? And the answer was no. So it was a small reason why I left what I did.
Let's get stuck into some of the meat of what you had to say, John. First of all, the matter of choice, human choice. And you say that unfettered choice is liberalism's enemy within. There are, in fact, external enemies, but there is the enemy within of unfettered choice, and I agree with that. Years ago, I read Charles Taylor's little but excellent book, The Ethics of Authenticity.
Yes.
Where he says, makes the point that an authentic choice that doesn't draw its value, draw its significance from some larger, wider horizon of value is empty of any significance. So you have to have some larger, he talks about horizon of value, I talk about objective value. But let me ambush you a bit here. In 2020, I published a book on rights that you then reviewed in the New Statesman. And you made some very nice remarks that I've been dining out on ever since. But you also talked about the myth of natural morality, whereas in my book I'd argued that as a Christian, even where there's no law and no rights, there are natural moral principles that obtain, and there's natural justice even where there's no law and rights. But you didn't like that idea. You said that this is a myth, this myth of natural morality. And yet, this evening, you talked of choices that are inherently damaging, of actions that are intrinsically vicious and incompatible with a good life. And you talked about liberal civilization beginning to consume itself when it came to believe its values were freestanding. Surely you are talking actually of natural morality, aren't you?
Well, I guess this leads into issues of theology, whether you think that, as Thomists, most Catholics do that, the core of the religion, of the morality that God prescribes can also be derived from natural reason. If you think that, then what you say is true. But if you think, as I do, that natural reason doesn't go that far, that there might be, I mean, the way Aristotle argued, I'm not generally that keen on Aristotle, but he did make some important points. For example, he said that without the virtue of prudence, human beings couldn't do anything valuable. So that would be, I suppose, a natural virtue. I mean, you don't need God to support that. If you're constantly timid, constantly frightened, constantly anxious, if you back off from everything you do, you'll just achieve nothing. That's a natural fact. And I guess in that sense, as Aristotle also said, creatures other than humans can have virtues and moralities. He speaks long before animal rights of the virtues of dolphins. They hunt fish together, they play together and various. So there'll be some virtues that go with the natures of the creatures concerned. So I'm ready to accept that that may be true, for example, in the case of prudence and possibly the other side of prudence, courage. If you have no courage at all, if you're constantly worrying what other people are thinking about or whatever scrapes you might get into by saying what you think, if you have no courage like that, you probably won't achieve anything either. But I don't think it goes as far as you do. I mean, there'll be some elements of morality, if you like, that are non-reciprocal. I mean, for Hobbes, mostly reciprocal. But what I mean by that is that if an enemy attacks you and tortures people and rapes people and does other abominable things, that may release you from some moral restraints in responding to the enemy, but not from all. You can't say, well, they are raping and torturing, so we can rape and torture. There'll be some things you still shouldn't do, although the restraints might be weaker than they would be if they too respected these norms. And there are, obviously at this time, there are rather terrible and agonizing moral dilemmas arising of that kind when an enemy deliberately situates itself and its facilities in places that can only be disabled, involving heavy civilian damage. And this raises issues of whether there can be fully just wars of that kind. But there can certainly be wars that are less unjust than others. So what I would say is, there is some sort of, there might be some component of morality that's natural, and so I would be happy to rely on it. But I think it's much more restricted than I suggest. I don't think it would give you answers to. I know you wrote about this in your book, but I don't think it would give you answers, at least not conclusive answers, not answers that any reasonable person would have to accept on issues like euthanasia and abortion, because that would depend on all kinds of complicated empirical reasonings about slippery slopes and whatnot.
No, but I think maybe morality is misleading because different circumstances, different cultures do develop different moralities, but there may still be certain universal moral principles. And as for God, I mean, although I'm a Christian, it's not clear to me that if you believe in some kind of given moral horizon, some set of natural moral principles, it's not clear to me that you therefore have to believe in God. But I do observe that Thomas Nagel, the American philosopher, when he wrote his book Mind and Cosmos, in which he argued that value and matter are co-original. He said, although he himself is an atheist, partly because as a Jew he just can't reconcile the Holocaust with a good God, he nevertheless said he thinks that the notion of objective value has a natural home in theism.
I agree with the latter, but I would say that, I mean, one of the paradoxes we're suffering from now is one which occurs even within a secular morality, because take Mill, for example. He was a great, he very much favored people in what he called individuality. And I think, having read him fairly closely for 20 years, which I now regard as a kind of hiatus in my life, I wish I'd been doing something different. Maybe 20 weeks would have been enough, but not 20 years. I think what he believed was that there was a kind of kernel of individual nature in each human being, which could be discovered, not constructed, discovered. Maybe you could construct it in different ways, but it was actually there. In that sense, though it's subjective in being inside a human being or being a kind of range of possibilities in a human being, it is also objective. And I think the interesting change which has come about in hyperliberalism or woke is that that idea too seems to be almost rejected. The idea seems to be that each individual can and even ought to make of themselves whatever they want at any time. So there can no longer be error in that respect. Mm. So what I actually think is you don't so much need God as nature. You need at least individuals to have natures. You need species to have natures. And you need humans to have natures, not completely fixed, and not without contradictions within them, but if you ban the idea of nature, okay, then you have this, hyperliberal antinomianism, as it might be called, the hyperliberal idea that humans are self-creating creatures. I think the one thing we're not is self-creating creatures.
Yep. Okay. Still sticking with religion a bit, you said that you think of yourself as an atheist. Mm. That struck me as being an odd way of putting it. I don't think of myself as a Christian, I am one. So I just wonder whether to say you think of yourself as an atheist suggests a certain kind of standing back and looking at yourself and saying, well, that looks like an atheist.
Well, I've been guided by one of the lesser known philosophers of religion of our time, P.G. Wodehouse. Towards the end of his life, he was asked whether he had any religious beliefs. And he paused for a long time and said, well, you know, it's frightfully hard to say. And I don't think he was being coy. I think he was being realistic in the sense that belief is as much a fugitive sensation and impression as a proposition. So there might be no religious propositions that I would assent to, theoretically, but there might be, and inevitably will be, having grown up in a society which is still permeated by monotheistic Jewish, Christian beliefs and values. There will be some, and it's very hard, and I would think almost arrogant to think that one can eliminate them from one's mind altogether, which is one of the reasons why I've been an inveterate critic of what I call evangelical atheism, because it assumes that those who are propagating godlessness or atheism don't have any remnants of it in themselves, which I think is very rarely true. In fact, I think if you were really outside of the monotheistic way of thinking, you wouldn't want to evangelize to the extent that they do. I don't myself, so maybe I'm a bit further out. I mean, I don't want to convert everyone from believing in progress for a number of reasons. Many people, that's all they do believe in, so then they'd have nothing. But also, of course, if I could do that, it would be progress, so it's not likely, and it's probably not even possible. So that's why it's the elusiveness of belief, which I think David Hume understood, because the way he represents belief in a lot of his writings is as a sensation, actually, a kind of fugitive sense. You tend to believe this, but then it evaporates and goes away. The mind, he says, is like a theatre. People come on and figures come and go. And so I would never be so I might in that sense be ultimately what people call an agnostic, but I use the term atheist because I don't find the idea of a creator God necessary to my way of thinking. And that's how maybe rather narrowly I define atheism.
Okay, fine. But nevertheless, you have a certain sympathy for monotheism.
Yes.
And you say at one point that monotheism gave us liberal tolerance. Now, immediately, it's a bit counterintuitive, because monotheism also gave us the Inquisition and the Ayatollahs. So how exactly, remind us again, how you think monotheism gave us liberal tolerance?
I think it gave us liberal tolerance by a certain kind of radical questioning, as I mentioned in the book of Job. Job doesn't reject faith. In the end, he returns to it, actually. Faith meaning, in this case, not a set of propositions, but trust, a kind of trust in his maker. And I think tolerance begins with the recognition that there are some questions that are unanswerable. There are some questions to which there are several reasonable answers, but reason can't actually conclusively show one to be better than all the rest. In other words, tolerance begins in a kind of in questioning, in doubt. Whereas when I think of the Socratic method of Socrates, I think that was a method of uncovering truths which would then be free from doubt, the universal forms or idea of the good, and an idea of the good in which actually all goods merge together, as they do not in human life. What we know, the world we know, the human world we know, is a world in which goods conflict with other goods, with bads, and bads conflict with worse bads. That's the world we actually know. We don't know of any other world. I don't think there is any other world. But if you're a Platonist or a Christian, you do. But at least if you're a Christian or a Jewish believer and some other monotheistic believers, you'll say we can't know fully because that perfection, that harmony is not fully revealed to us. It's there, you have faith, but it's not fully revealed. And I think that's a much more intelligible and reasonable position. It's also more serious. It's serious in the sense that it takes the limitations of the human mind very seriously and doesn't imagine a world in which these questions which have possessed and thinkers and philosophers and many ordinary people in ordinary human experience in battle, in life, in death, losing loved ones, and so on, have confronted and found very difficult and not finally resolved, but come to some kind of partial resolution. It treats all of those people as sort of backward. It's as if no one has yet lived a fully human life. It'll be lived as an effect of altruism about 20 million years from now by people who are incomparably more knowledgeable than we are. But I find that a ridiculous, silly, kind of infantile conception, rather like the idea that if you understand elementary mathematics, you can make hundreds of billions of dollars in the crypto markets.
Yeah, so I think a necessary condition of tolerance is humility and recognizing the gap between the self and goodness, truth, and beauty, whether you call that God or not, but a sense in which you are beholden to spiritual values that transcend you and judge you. And if you think of yourself in relation to truth that way, then when you engage in conversation, you have to be humble because you know your limits, and it could be that the person you're talking to has truth to tell you. But dialogue then is not to do with winning or humiliating or dominating. It's about a common engagement of creatures, I would say fallen creatures, not just limited, but also inclined to avert their eyes from truths that are uncomfortable. But together, in spite of our limits, because of our humility, we are able to approximate the truth more nearly. But therefore, I have to tolerate views that I don't like.
Yes, or even hate.
Because you might be right.
Or even hate.
Yeah, because you might be right. Because I know that I and the truth are not one.
Well, that's what I meant by saying that the truth must be independent of the human mind and only of any human mind or of all human minds, and only partially knowable by it. But I think one of the ways discourse has become degraded in our time is, well, you could think of it as the decay of or the almost disappearance of the institution and practice of debate. I mean, I remember what debates were like, not just at school, but when people came together with different views, they respected one another. It might be rough debates, but they questioned each other and they came up with arguments and counter-arguments. Underlying them, even if they had a robust disdain for each other's views, was the idea of an objective truth, but also there was an idea that human beings, even the cleverest and most knowledgeable, only have fragments of it, partial of it. What's happened now is that some views are considered so obviously true, so self-evidently true, that there can't be any debate about them, which is why I never do debates. I'm very often asked to do debates, and I've never accepted that for many years and won't accept it. The debates now are like Gilbert and Sullivan without the songs, or without. It's a sort of Edwardian practice, which is because it faded away. The Edwardians knew they were skating on thin ice in some ways. If you read the great Edwardian fiction writers, Conrad, Wells, Hardy, they all had the idea that the moral fabric around them was shaky. And they were the great times of debates. They were debating with each other all the time. If people think that they can be certain, either because they have some kind of knowledge which is indubitable, or because there really isn't truth or knowledge outside the human mind, they're just going to impose it by will. then there can't be debates, or they're a waste of time. They either end up as shouting matches, or they end up as people talking past each other, which is what happens. So I have nothing to do with them myself, which in a way is a pity, because they were valuable things in the past. But it's now, it's like playing football without the ball or something. It's an absurdity.
We have a few minutes left, so let's finish by talking about wokery. Mm-hmm. And you suggest that wokery is a mutant variant of Christianity. Mm.
No, well, that's one of the things it is, or might be.
Explain that again.
Well, I mean, I'm not alone in thinking that one of the ways in which Christianity differed from the ancient pagan world was that it raised up the victims in the world. It raised up the powerless. There were classical thinkers and writers and philosophers who had sympathy for slaves and for human suffering. But on the whole, I mean, if you think of someone like Epicurus, the founder of Epicureanism, the ancient hedonist, I think it's, and Lucretius, the great Epicurean, the Roman poet, what they aimed for was a kind of tranquility in a garden or in some other way, in which it never occurred to them that that was tainted or tarnished by the fact that large parts of humanity were suffering in terrible ways. They didn't feel any need to justify the fact that the worst off in the world, the most powerless in the world, the most unhappy and broken in the world, were the way they were. Whereas I take it that one of the things that Christianity brought into the ancient civilization was through, indeed, even the idea of Jesus himself, who was broken on the cross, who was desperate and despairing, who thought that he'd been abandoned by God, that pure example of victimhood could be somehow divine or a vessel of divinity. So that's a profound, I don't know, there may be classical scholars here tonight or in Oxford could say that some ancient thinkers and did have that idea, but I certainly don't think it was dominant. I certainly don't think that it was widespread. So it's a profound change. And I guess one of the things that has happened now is that wokery is about identification with a rather selective, it must be said, sometimes highly selective, list of victims. I've tried to discover and count on the internet how many mass demonstrations there have been for the Uyghurs. Yes. Haven't been any, not large ones anyway. There have been people turning up and protesting, but very few. How many have there been for the Chechens? Also Muslims, by the way, who were, their capital city was completely wiped out, destroyed to total rubble in the course of the Chechen wars, which were accompanied by enormous amounts of execution, torture, sexual violence, the whole thing. Not a squeak. Although in any other, hardly a squeak, a few tiny people objecting here and there outside of embassy, but not gigantic demonstrations exploding all over the world at the same time. Now, you might speculate on the reason for that, but the one thing that it teaches me is that the victimhoods which are selected by, well, I think are very, very highly selected, but why focus solely on, or primarily on, alleged or real victims? Why do that? And I think that's a Christian inheritance. So the idea, many people say it's a kind of repaganization. I don't think it is a repaganization. Nietzsche and other thinkers in the 19th century attempted a kind of repaganization of culture. And it usually turns out, in fact, always turns out to be ridiculous, because I think there can be, so to speak, self-respecting and even healthy forms of paganism before Christianity. There were. But once Christianity's come into the world, once it's changed our moral sensibilities, getting rid of it produces monsters. Suppressing it to repaganize, as, say, the Nazis did to some extent with their ridiculous new religions, that they invented forms of Norse paganism and so on, always produces, at best, at the very best, absurdity, and at the worst, a cult of cruelty, even, and of slavery and of dominance, as it did. So that's, I say, why you don't think it's, I mean, I guess the reason you don't think it's Christian, let me put these words in.
No, I didn't say that.
No. But if you do, I think one reason might be that there's no sense either of forgiveness, but also there's no sense of original sin in there. So, I mean, in other words, in Christianity, there is the focus on the victim, the supreme victim, the divine victim of Jesus as being kind of a symbol or cipher for all this. But it's also asserted that since all human beings all are creaturely, none of us can achieve fully the good we can ever know, so we should all have forbearance for each other. That's lacking too. So it isn't. It's a form of non-Augustinian Christianity. But then again, there've been, I mean, American Puritanism was non-Augustinian Christianity, and I think one of the oddities of wokery is that although it's spread widely, particularly I would say, and most virulently, I think, in the Anglophone world, it's less strong, even in Europe. And not strong at all in Christian Orthodox countries, actually, societies. Although it's spread very, very strongly in these Anglophone countries, it's drawing on a rather particular version of Christianity in which the Augustinian element is diminished.
Sure. I mean, I agree with you that the wokery, as it were, has got the message of the Old Testament prophets against injustice very well. It's completely lost the idea that even the woke champion of the oppressed is himself a sinner, right? And therefore needs to be constrained in the way that he judges other people. But I guess I've become a bit more cynical lately because I've noticed.
It happens.
Yeah, it does. I noticed that in the Rose Must Fall protests in 2015-16, here you have a group of mainly postgraduate Oxford students, lots of them on Rhodes scholarships, rather privileged, cheerfully biting the hand that feeds them, hollering for the dismantling of an obscure statue of a long-dead British imperialist, Cecil Rhodes. At the same time, that Jacob Zuma in South Africa is looting the South African state, driving the South African state to the brink of insolvency, risking the well-being of his people. And what did the protesters outside of Oriel College have to say about that? I mean, a real-time human tragedy and scandal, nothing. So it seemed to me that I'm not persuaded that in every case the woke crusader really cares about the oppressed or the voiceless as much as about the perception and social status of the crusader.
Oh, I'm sure that's true. I mean, the best enemies to have are dead ones.
Yes, they can't fight back, can they?
I mean, and particularly almost unknown ones that have almost been, there may be a statue to them, but they've been largely forgotten who they were. So you can then achieve an enormous amount of moral self-gratification. Yeah. And I think woke, I mean, this is one of my objections to it. Woke is largely a culture of moral vanity. Those who protest it, those who profess it and engage in it, see themselves as not exactly martyrs, because it's usually to their career advancement, but as embodiments of virtue. Let me make one comment here, which might help briefly towards the end. There was a time when there have been societies when truth-telling was very costly. And for example, an example of that would be in the Soviet bloc when it existed. I traveled there a bit and talked to people. And the reason it was, to me, that there were many genuine moral heroes in those societies, not all of them well known, was that the costs were very severe. And not only to the persons who deviated from communist orthodoxy, but also to their families. Who could lose medical care, they could lose higher education, they could lose career advancement, because whole families were punished. So actually deviating from an orthodoxy in those conditions requires enormous enormous capacity for self-sacrifice and sacrifice of others, and enormous moral courage. Now the interesting thing in B, I tend to think that the woke intelligentsia are more morally culpable because there's so much less at stake for them. That's to say, the only thing I can see that's at stake for them is career. I mean, if you deviate from, even in today's woke-ridden Britain, if you deviate from woke, your child is not yet denied medical NHS treatment. Your grandmother isn't kicked out of her social housing. Others are not. So all that is lost is Korea. And so I tend to think, actually, and this may be an example of cynicism, that it actually is primarily, in most cases now, a strategy of career advancement and nothing much more than that. There isn't inside the kind of core of moral conviction that there was among anti-communist resistors in the former Soviet bloc. Inside, you could meet them at official gatherings and they would repeat all the, at the gatherings, they would repeat all the formula, but get them aside somewhere, and if they trust you, you would find they believed something completely different. What would you find that the wokists believe, I think, in themselves, in another context? I would suggest nothing.
So on that note, let's thank John Gray.